Welcome to Week Old Beans, what I believe is gonna be episode. Let me check. Shit. Fowler, help me. What episode is this?
I don't remember. It's over 20 at this
Jesus
point.
Christ. See my fucking co-host, how useless he is. Week Old Beans, episode 24. That's the episode we're on, guys. I am a great host, knowing the number of episodes that we've done in the past, 8 months we've been doing this podcast. I am RDOT. I am the orchestrator of this podcast. I am the one that does 99% of the work, and I have my co-host with me, Fowler, who kind of just sits there and stares stupidly at the Discord screen. And then laughs like fucking Elmer Fudge.
I bring the incisive commentary to this channel.
Alright, yeah, incisive. More like decisive. Anyway, we flubbed the last episode because actually Fowler flubbed the last episode because his audio was
You're in
dog
charge
shit.
of the audio shit.
No, no. Hey. Just because you know how long it took us to film last episode because you couldn't get your fucking mic together. It took forever. All right, so
I'm not a tech smart person.
That's yeah, we know. Yeah, clearly. Yeah, that's why all of the responsibilities were put onto me. I've offered to teach you to edit, but you refuse because you're stubborn. And your computer sucks and will blow up if you put anything beyond 123 or like fucking Movie Maker on it. So we flubbed the first episode. So this is round number 2, filming episode 24, Week Old Beans. As I said, I'm RDOT and I got my host Fowler with me, and we have a couple things we want to talk about. Most notably, we want to talk about some of the comments that have been made by former president and current projected Republican nominee for the presidency, Donald Trump, and some of the really uncomfortable things that he has said about his political opponents, echoing the words of Hitler by calling them all sorts of names, like and are you good?
I'm good.
Okay.
I swallowed up. I swallowed something. Wait, let's just redo that bet.
No, we're not going to redo shit. I was going to make a comment, but I decided against it for your own sake. Fowler, we're fine. Anyway, he's made some pretty uncomfortable comments about his political opponents, and so we wanted to talk about that, and then we also wanted to talk about what was the other thing we wanted to talk about? We both have bad memory problems. This is the problem. Well, what did we talk about last episode, or last time we attempted to film this episode, Fowler?
I don't remember. The main thing we talked about was the Trump's recent rhetoric.
Oh, yeah. Let's talk primarily about that, and then maybe we can get into some more of the recent news that's happened in the past like 2 days, because we tried to film it like 2 days ago. So Fowler, I think when we filmed it, I let you go ahead and summarize your thoughts because you had a little bit more to say about it than I did, and you're kind of the expert on rhetoric and political speech here. So I'll let you jump into it and explain to the people what happened, explain, why his comments are concerning, and, what exactly it harkens back to.
So President Trump has gotten in trouble because he basically has been using rhetoric that is historically fascistic. He's been calling his political opponents vermin, and he's been talking about basically cleansing them when he becomes the president, which is very dangerous, and it's a classic fascist technique to dehumanize your opponents, making them less human, less empathetic, relatable, so that basically you are given free range to do whatever you want to them. It's very dangerous, and it harkens back to a much more ancient and I think dark time.
Yeah, it is concerning, and at this point, I don't know if it really matters, because at this point, it seems that he is going to be the Republican nominee for the presidency. I mean, he's like, what, 50-something percent, 60%? He's crushing the
competition. Yeah, 50 something.
Yeah, and, as Fowler and I have discussed, the Democratic Party seems to be incapable of putting up a worthwhile fight against a figure like Trump. The polling for Biden doesn't seem to be in his favor, and we're about a year out. So I will say, I'm skeptical about speculating, but I'm also, if the polling's looking bad now, it's not a good sign.
No, not at all.
So, when it comes to like Trump's increasingly fascistic rhetoric, I mean, it's a stark contrast to how he was speaking even a year ago. Um, you know, Fowler, do you want to elaborate a little bit more about, why we need to be concerned about the stuff that he's saying?
Well, essentially, like what I was saying earlier, like the reason fascists use rhetoric where they compare their political opponents to animals and things like that is because you're trying to dehumanize your opposition so that it's easier for you to do extreme and often extra legal things to them. Famously, the Nazis did this to the Jewish people. They would basically frame the Jews as being amoral and inhuman and monstrous. And this gave them the justification that they needed um, to put them in camps and to persecute them politically without basically retaliation. So it is certainly a very scary thing.
Yeah, it is. Yeah, it's concerning, and I don't know. So I guess like I think we are very unfamiliar with because what I do want to kind of touch on, and I think it's important that we touch on this. Why is it that Americans have been so slow to respond, or at least the government has been so slow to respond to a figure like Donald Trump? Because if you guys remember, I mean, they waited almost a full year until after January 6th to launch any sort of, like investigation. Everything else beforehand was basically just like, uh, I forgot what the word is, but everything beforehand was basically just formalities, denouncements and, oh, and how can you do this? Oh, this is terrible, but no real actual action was taken. The impeachment at that point, like the impeachment meant nothing because, it's not like the Senate was or the House was gonna. I forgot if it was the House or the Senate, but the other branch was not going to remove him from office, and he was also not president anyway. Um, so we have been very slow to respond to Trump, and I think there's sort of a lesson there to be learned, and maybe Fowler, our conversation about that we had yesterday outside the podcast would be better to talk about is why is it that America has been so slow to respond to Trump? Is it because unlike Europe, we don't really have a history of fascism? I mean, there's only been, one demagogic president, and that was back during Andrew Jackson's time before, the mechanisms were in place for Jackson to do a lot of the things that like Trump was attempting to do. And then, the closest to the White House anybody has ever gotten was Huey Long of Louisiana. So is it just that we don't have a lot of experience dealing with figures like Trump? We've never had sort of a national figure, national totalitarian or authoritarian figure, whereas European history is just, pretty much most of it.
Littered with them.
Yeah, it's littered with multiple authoritarian, fascistic, anti-democratic figures.
Yeah, I think that's part of it. The other thing that I think it is as well is uh, like Trump's rhetoric is, I think, very difficult to analyze because of the fact he basically says everything to everyone. Like, I think it's harder to, when he says things that are fascistic, it's not perceived as badly because he's constantly saying insane things. So it sort of blends into it blends into everything else that he says and does. I think he's a really difficult person to analyze rhetorically because of that fact.
Yeah, I mean there is a numbness that has sort of plagued politics. I mean, I think it's in the past 6 or 7 years, really since 2016, like what was considered the political norm has completely changed. I mean, Fowler and I are both, we're older, but we're not that old. I mean, we are, of the generation that remembers 9/11 and remembers the post 9/11, the pre 9/11 and post 9/11 America, and the Bush administration, the Obama administration, we both remember uh, how politics were back in those days. And, the shift from Trump to now has just been, you know, absolutely, it's just been, it's different. It's a different way. And I would argue some of that social media, a lot of that is compounded by social media. The way that we interact with each other now is completely different. But putting that aside, I think, you know, one of the dangers of Trump, or at least one of the things that Trump has done, is, it's kind of like a reverse boy that cried wolf situation where you say so many crazy things, you're able to get away with saying the crazy thing.
Yeah, I would agree with that. It's a lot of that eclecticism. It protects Trump. In fact, a very good YouTuber, Thoughts Slime, talked about Nick Fuentes, the famous white nationalist, using very similar techniques of basically him, um, basically like him mixing in irony and kind of Zoomer terminology as a way of hiding from people his what he was actually planning. Like you bake the white nationalism or the fascism into a bunch of other insane things that you say and do, and it has the effect of um, masking your intent, which I think is a very like the whole like using irony and irreverence to hide your power level is very much a 21st century fascist phenomenon.
It absolutely is, and I think too it's a 21st century phenomenon that has become amplified by internet culture. I don't know, there's probably a unique, there's probably a paper that could be written about whether or not how Donald Trump influenced the use of irony in media, or if the use of irony, and, like trolling, quote unquote. I'm gonna use the word trolling just because I feel like that's more understandable in the internet lexicon. But, it'd be interesting to see if there was a way to see how much effect Trump had on the use of internet trolling, or if the use of internet trolling was something that occurred due to our increasing isolation and our increasing generational cynicism towards institutions, towards society. But I do think the two go hand in hand. Like, I think it is on the internet now, like, stirring shit up is something that everybody does, regardless of whether or not you're on the right, the left, and the middle. I mean, it is a business now online to essentially use rhetoric, not because you're trying to push for a greater point, but because you're trying to piss off somebody else.
Yeah.
And Trump definitely, definitely contributed to that. I don't know if he started it, but, um, I think that's allowed for Trump to get away with a lot of the things that he's gotten away with, because it is just, at least on the internet and in media spaces, we're living in a very so
Sorry.
there's this thing on your phone, Fowler, where you can turn off your ringtone.
I forgot to turn it off on my Mac computer.
There's a thing on your Mac computer where you can turn off.
All right, keep going. Keep going. Make your point.
I'm just making fun of you. I'm keeping this in. I think
Yeah.
everybody needs to see the shit I put up with when I film this. Fucking phone's going off. Goddamn. But
All right,
no,
this is the first time, okay?
no, it's not. This is like the third time. this
This is lies and
is this is
slander.
blasphemy. No, for real though. Like, so yeah. So my broader point is just I'm speaking mostly on like how the internet has you know amplified a lot of Trump's bad tendencies and changed the political landscape. And, it's difficult to navigate. Do you have any commentary on that?
Was the alt right? I'm trying to remember timeline. Was the alt right before Trump? or was it after Trump? I can't remember timeline
It
wise
it was around the
which one
exact
came
same.
first.
It was around the exact same time. There was a direct. There has been. I mean, I've read research on this. There was a direct correlation between Donald Trump's rhetoric and the rise of the alt right. Essentially, what people argue, and I'm not saying I'm arguing this. This is what people argue, that Trump's rhetoric gave the alt right a free pass to enter into the public space. Having a figure like Donald
Mm.
Trump who was willing to go on stage and say, "Hey, actually, you know, we should build a wall. Mexicans are rapists. Immigration is causing. Or as he said recently. I mean, the most recent thing he said in regards to immigration was that immigrants were poisoning the blood of America. But back in 2016, he wasn't saying stuff like that. He was saying, that they're bringing over drugs, they're rapists, et cetera, et cetera. Um, people like Richard Spencer and people like Richard Spencer, David Duke, et cetera. They supported a Trump presidency. Um, but the alt right,
Supported him. But I wonder who's first because it's probably whoever was birthed first is
I
probably the
don't think
one
I don't think
who
it's a
started using
matter
that
of
terminology.
what I don't think it's a matter of who was first. I think, if you spend any time online, even before Donald Trump, there were spaces on the internet always that harbored people like Richard Spencer and David Duke. Those sorts of things were considered fringe, but they were always there. It's not to me about who came first, it's about which figure. Number one, the rise in the amount of people viewing that sort of rhetoric. And I think as the internet became more democratized, as the internet became more complex, and the alt right rebranded itself from the skinhead KKK hood wearing, like uncouth, like southern adjacent, uh, you know, people, they rebranded to be the intellectuals, the Richard Spencers, the people with the degrees, the people who had, maybe like a military background, or at the very least a background in official government or combat. As they rebranded themselves and started to paint themselves as more respectable, they were able to enter into mainstream spaces, bolstered by, Donald Trump. Donald Trump made it acceptable to critique. He made it acceptable to critique and question immigration. I mean, beforehand, that really wasn't something that people did. If they did do it, it was never really about South Americans or Mexicans. It was mostly about Arabs and Muslims. Post 9/11. If people were skeptical about immigration, they were skeptical of Islam. They were not skeptical of, um, just the immigrant as sort of a political bloc. Um, you know, um, and even, when I remember, people talking about immigration, when I was, before Trump, but it never was the way that it is now. It was always considered, a fringe sort of like, oh, look at Texas, Arizona dealing with this, boohoo problem. Um,
Mm.
so I don't think it's a matter of who came first. I think it's a matter of the exposure effect and the rise of the internet. Because I think Richard Spencer has always been there. I mean, Richard Spencer. I mean, I read an expose on him, and he was writing about the JQ before Trump. I mean, it's just nobody listened to him, and then he realized he could put on a suit and go on CNN, and all of a sudden, he'd
Be
made it.
taken somewhat seriously,
Yeah,
yeah. I think to some degree, like the using irony to mask the reality of your politics and using like kind of stream of consciousness to hide it. I think that it's negative in that I think it's an extremely effective tactic, but I think the reason that they are forced to do that is um, because of the lack of sort of precedent of fascism. They can't get out and say the things that they would normally say in different countries that are more like susceptible to that rhetoric. So they kind of have to mask. Um, they have to mask what they really believe through irony in a way that I think points to the Overton window not being as far across as they might want. If that makes sense.
yeah. Um, I mean, y'all have to remember that like Trumpism and like that sort of ideology, and it is an ideology nowadays. Trumpism is a legitimate It is a legitimate, tour de force, but it's only about like it's less than like what 20% of the population.
Yeah,
Um,
about 20%.
yeah, it's not a now of the population of people that vote for president. It's a significant amount, but in terms of the overall American population, it's 20%. Which that's not a large number of people compared to the Democrats, and that's always been the case. The Democratic Party for a very long time has always had advantages in numbers. I mean, there are more registered Democrats than there are registered Republicans, and overall, more people in the United States lean towards the left than they do lean towards the right. You can look at this, if you just look at basic issues and the polling on basic issues, Medicare for all, pretty much anything to do with infrastructure, anything to do with LGBTQ, rights, women's rights, like a vast majority, abortion, vast majority of Americans are on the left with stuff like that. Now, whether or not that translates into real, tangible political gains, that's a different story. But, um,
Well, the problem with fascism in general is that you don't actually need the majority to be on your side. You only
no.
need to win an election once, and then you're set because you'll end democracy.
Yeah, exactly, exactly. Um, it's we just don't have a precedent for something like this, and I think that is where we are lacking in comparison to like the United Kingdom, who has had to deal directly with a fascist threat, and who has had to deal directly with you know um, disruptions to the institution that go beyond a civil war or a split from a larger body.
Mm.
Um, so Europe's got experience, and of course, fascism, it's you have to stuff it out, and it always is. It comes in many different forms, and it's not just a Germany thing. We have a very specific image of fascism. That's heavily tied to Nazi Germany and Italy, but the like fascist organizations exist in every culture and every they can exist in every region of the world. Um, So I guess I had on my mind the secondary point that I was wanting to talk about, but I think it slipped my mind a little bit because I was rambling.
We
Um,
can keep talking about this. I think we have more to say today than we did yesterday about this subject.
yeah, no, definitely. If I can remember my point, I'll say it. But do you have anything to add, Fowler, while I think of this?
Uh, I think I think we are seeing. So I think when Donald Trump came to the scene initially, I think people were completely unprepared for his rhetoric and sort of who he was as a person. And I think I'm still very worried about the 2024 election, but I think like Trumpism, because it is an ideology now and because like it is somewhat established, like political players can define Trumpism, and I think they can also fight against Trumpism far more effectively than they did initially because like the DNC and the Democratic Party have sort of had time to adjust to it and to like create counter strategies. Um, and I think you see this with the alt right as well, where they had a lot of trouble identifying what the alt right was initially, but now if you ask someone what's the alt right, they're pretty open. It's just that they're fascists. You know what I mean? They're white nationalists, and I think that's very positive because I think it indicates that the element of surprise that Trump had initially, I think some of that is faded. And the question is whether or not the same strategies will be as effective now that we know what they're planning and we know how they do it.
Yeah, there's very specific steps that the Democratic Party could easily take for 2024. One of them is replacing Biden with somebody who's not Joe Biden. And this, I'm saying this as somebody who doesn't really have anything against Joe Biden personally. I just think his approval ratings are in the trash, and I think he's too old. Um, I think he is the problem. Not his policy, not his personality, but him and him as a walking, talking, sort of political body. Um,
Yeah.
so that's one thing, and because I think other than that, they've got everything in the bag. Um, the second thing I'll say, and this is something that I think this was the second topic I wanted to talk about is on the topic of the Democratic Party is proper resistance to somebody like Donald Trump, and like like I think that the people on the left do have a tendency to, because we've never had a liberalism has always been the established order in the United States. Of course, none of us were around in the, nobody was around in from the Jacksonian era. So, I mean, and even then, the context of that era was just so different than what it is now that it doesn't really matter what analysis you could superimpose onto it; it wouldn't make sense. But like I do think liberalism, and I'm not the first who has said this, and this is primarily one of the reasons why leftism, maybe not liberalism, but leftism, um, and this is one of the reasons I've stepped away from the left, to be honest with you. Sometimes when a topic becomes so cemented, you never teach people how to properly discuss discuss it. When something becomes the norm, if you're not careful and you don't actually establish a way to allow people to learn how to discuss disagreements pertaining to the norm, you sort of like sterilize people's ability to recognize when there's a problem. And I think in 2016 that's what happened. I think in 2016 Trump told people who he was, and the Democratic Party and sort of the liberal slash left wing establishment and order, the media, the politicians, the people, were not able to properly recognize. I think they recognized the threat, but you had this explosion of what I would say, I mean, what people would now call wokeness, where, like, like you don't teach people how to have proper discourse. I'm kind of rambling right now because I'm really trying to think of how to put this into a way that makes sense. Um, you sterilize the conversation by not teaching people like that the status quo isn't always going to be the status quo. You have to defend democracy. You have to defend your beliefs. You always have to fight for your beliefs. Like nothing is ever set in stone. We are humans, we make these rules. We establish these rules, but one person can come through and completely tear them apart. Our society and our structures are very sensitive. Um, and I mean, fucking Christ, like, you know, the amount of damage that George W. Bush did to the fucking America, like, it's fucking unprecedented. And that was one smooth talking Connecticut Republican uh, who LARPed as a
when
fucking
when
Southerner.
when there when you create a hegemony and you get to a point where people are um when you've normalized a certain ideology, it can create blind spots for people who basically they you haven't had to actually push your ideology because it has been the norm for so long. I think is kind of the problem.
Yeah.
Where
Uh,
like liberalism has been the dominant ideology for at this point like many decades. Like liberalism won the battle in the 1950s, and even though the Republicans have like increased their power, like we haven't had a true reactionary Republican Party, I think, in the old sense in a long time. They have been just more conservative liberals. So I think it's been a long time since the Democratic Party really had to like stand on their own.
and there's no vigor, I mean, in the party right now. That's my biggest complaint. I mean, the squad is doing the best they can, but I am increasingly becoming more skeptical that one of the problems with the Democratic Party is there is not that sort of rabid vigor that you see from, say, Republicans like Matt Gaetz, Marjorie Taylor Greene. Not saying that we need to have a Democratic Marjorie Taylor Greene, but that sort of energy and that fierceness and that sort of, desire to truly fight for your beliefs is just lacking in a lot of ways. Um, and I don't know if, and this is a different conversation. I mean, I've made comments to Fowler before that, especially when it comes to people on the left, especially people that, the farther left you get, at least in this political climate, in the way that the left is structured right now, like, I have a lot of concerns about how I think, like, certain ideological methods have crept their way into the way that people on the left view building power. Um,
Well, the
but
problem
that's a
is
different conversation.
the more radical you get, the less mainstream you are in the way that you view the world and the way you do it, the more it's on you to discover that. You know what I mean? Like
Yeah,
if you're a
absolutely.
moderate liberal, like, you know,
Not much
the
heavy lifting.
path of that the path is tread for you. You don't have to, but if you decide you want to be an anarchist or a communist, because so much of your ideology has to be self-education because it's so outside the mainstream norm, it requires you to be media savvy enough and educated enough to actually pull together a coherent ideology. And I think that's why radicals are often so embarrassing is that they, you know, the more radical you are, the more difficult it is to kind of come up with the ideology and the more you have to do it yourself.
Yeah, no, absolutely, absolutely. And I'm speaking mostly when I say the left right now. I'm speaking mostly to, you know, certain sects of the online left and the mainstream left. But
Arda and I were talking. I think we are not going to talk about this specifically, but we've had a debate for some time. One of the topics that we were thinking about talking about, but we weren't sure about, is there are a bunch of relatively prominent leftists on Twitter who were basically and TikTok who were basically making pro Bin Laden arguments, and what we were talking about is like are is it a good idea to cover them? Like, are they just a very vocal minority that don't have any power, or are they like the alt right where they are kind of this minority, but they represent the cultural zeitgeist and need to be taken seriously? And I think that's a very difficult debate
yeah, no,
because it is low hanging fruit to just pick the crazies on each side
yeah,
and sort of show them as like the ideology. I mean, Fox News famously does that with liberalism.
yeah,
They
absolutely.
deliberately pick like super fringe weirdos and try and frame them as like the mainstream democratic position.
Yeah, no,
But
it's
also the alt right was totally ignored for just too long, I think. So like there are dangers of the other side of things as well.
yeah, we were, yeah, my argument was kind of like what Fowler just said, where I was making the argument that, like, you just always have to keep an eye out because that fringe demographic that you look at is just the crazies. Like, I think it's a generational shift. Like, my worry is that this next, our generation, Fowler and I's generation, then the generation behind us, that like, they're being inundated with so much material because of social media, material that they otherwise would have. I mean, if TikTok wasn't around, if social media wasn't around, you would have had I don't even think the letter, what was it, the Bin Laden's letter to America, I don't even know if anybody would have been able to have gotten their hands on that, like
Mm.
but we live in an age of um mass online democracy, and anybody can get anything and say anything, and then it kind of just spreads. But that is a different video topic, so maybe we'll have a conversation about that in the future. I don't want to get too deep into that because there is Fowler and I have different opinions about that I do think are worth discussing. So I think you could also relate this to the sort of online left wing response to the Israel Palestine conflict as well, because there's some points of contention about radicalism, extremism on that end too. But that's a different video.
Mm.
Um, fuck, what was I gonna say? Oh yeah, so I guess it remains to be seen whether or not the Democratic Party will pull through and defeat Trumpism, and how much time do we have? I think, the other thing I was going to talk about, and this was another point in contention that Fowler and I had the other day when we were talking, was, speaking on the various lawsuits that Trump has, would it be more ethical for Trump to be taken out, or would it be more beneficial for Trump to be taken out by the people or by the institutions? And the argument that I made to that topic was basically that, you know,
And by the people versus institutions, we're talking about like
Democrat,
the
yeah.
difference between electorally voting him out of office versus like the legal system like bans him from ballots. Is kind of the discussion, just in
Yes.
case people might not know.
Yeah. So, just to give a little backstory on this, as of yesterday, an appeal has been made. A plaintiff has appealed Colorado constituents' attempts at getting Trump banned from the ballot. So essentially, what's happening across the country, and I think it's like 4 or 5 states right now, is there is a argument being made that due to the fact that he committed an insurrection against the United States government, that Trump should not be allowed to be on the presidential ballot. There was a Civil War era law that was passed that essentially said anybody who attempts an insurrection against the United States government cannot hold office. Um, this has never been used against a presidential candidate. I'm not sure if it's ever been used against
I think we
a
used it after the Confederacy fell apart.
yeah,
I
we
think
did, we
that's the
did, we
only
did.
time.
Yeah, so I'm sure it was used against like lower officials in local government or in state government, or in representative House of Representatives, Senate, whatever. But this is the first time it's ever been applied against a president. And the argument is that because Trump attempted a coup, he should not be allowed on the ballot. Now, putting aside whether or not what your legal interpretation of that is, um, the Colorado court or court in Colorado basically said like he has to be on the ballot because while he did commit an insurrection, there is no precedent, I believe was her argument, and the specific law does not specify whether or not it can be applied to a president.
Hmm.
And this decision has been appealed by a plaintiff and will go to a higher court. Um, so the debate, the discussion that Fowler and I were having was basically about whether or not it is morally, ethically, or strategically better for Trump to potentially be defeated um, electorally, or if the mechanisms in place that we have work accordingly. And my argument was that I am skeptical about taking the gamble and saying, well, he needs to be, defeated electorally, um, because that is a dangerous. I mean, maybe not dangerous, but that is a dangerous gamble because if he wins in 2024, I mean, I'm not the first person who said this, but the democratic society that we live in as we know it will cease to exist. And I don't feel like I'm being an extremist when I say this. I don't feel like I'm being fear mongering about this because I know a lot of people have said, well, whatever. But based on the things that he has said and the actions that he and his administration are currently trying to take, I don't think it's a crazy thing to say that he intends on staying in office indefinitely. Um,
My concern is, I think
yeah, Fowler has, and
solving it
Fowler's
in
point
a
is, yeah,
non-electoral way to me feels like a pyrrhic victory, in that like you're not really attacking the reason fascism and Trumpism is popular in America, and you're not really de-radicalizing the populace. And I'm skeptical of the ability in a non-electoral sense to keep the Trumps down, because even if you stop Trump from being in the ballot electorally, if you haven't really defeated Trumpism in the American consciousness, if you haven't really created um, like a Democratic Party that can actually oppose Trumpism by itself, I think there's a very likely chance that just more Trump-like figures will come to power. And I'm skeptical of the ability to block them without like the consent of the people. So I think, uh, I think that's why the electoral argument is so important. Is
yeah,
Trumpism can't be defeated by elitist institutions through bureaucracy. It has to be defeated in the public square by the American people.
yeah. So to Fowler's point, I don't necessarily disagree, but the counter to that I would have, and the counter that I made when we had the initial discussion was, while I agree that it is ideal that such an ideology be defeated in the by the electoral body, I think the issue that I'm having is, and Fowler, you had a counter to this as well, but I think my worry is number one, it's a very hard gamble. And I think it was you that said to me yesterday that if Trump wins electorally, we would have been fucked anyway. So
Mm.
that it doesn't really matter. But the point that I made to that was that, I think regardless of what happens, the like Trumpism has been bolstered by the media. I think more than anything else, the media has bolstered many of the separations and divisions that exist in America right now. Fox News operates as a conservative propaganda body, and you know there's a lot of research that indicates that like the reality perceived by people who support Donald Trump and the reality perceived by people who don't are very different. I mean, they're almost what is it, irrecoverably different. They cannot be reconciled with each other. And so I think my thing is like, even if, like, let's say that there is a legal, there is, our institutions hold. And I think the other argument you could make to this is like, we if something like this does happen, right? If Trump's legal problems, with the being on the ballot, or the shit with his Georgia if all of these legal troubles that he's having, with both state and federal, and the federal government, if they all pile up and he is somehow taken out non-electorally, I think there's a good argument to be made, and this is something that the Democratic Party would have to do and have to work on. But I think there is a good argument to be made that we could become the first nation to defeat Hitler before he becomes Hitler. You know,
Mm.
that there is some benefit in the idea that that America successfully created a system where not only do we have democracy, but we are able to institutionally keep non-democratic figures from taking power. Um, because even in the absence of Donald Trump, even if Donald Trump were to be defeated electorally, those institutions would need to be put in place for the future. Um,
I agree.
the elect, like, I agree with Eric Posner, who wrote Demagogue's Playbook, but he said at the end of that book that when you remove Trump and you remove Trumpism from the American consciousness, the executive branch needs to be weakened. The executive branch has become too powerful and too all-reaching, and the next step would be to weaken the executive branch of the presidency. It would be to weaken the presidency, basically, which I agree with, and that would be one of the steps, I think, institutionally, that would have to be put in place to prevent something like this from ever happening again. So part of me thinks, like, okay, like, yes, it might seem like a cop out at first, but number one, Fox News is not going to go away, and Fox News, as long as Fox News continues to exist and go down the route that it's going down, like, Trump like figures are going to emerge because we have created the media atmosphere that perpetuates people like that. Like, even if it doesn't really matter. I guess that's maybe my argument, that like the Trumper people and the people on the far right, and they're still going to exist because, number one, America is changing regardless of you know, I guess whether you and I or anybody likes it or not. And also, we've created a media landscape that allows those sorts of views to stick in the public consciousness, whether we like it or not, and to be amplified. And then also, like, our institutions holding strong enough to take down an anti-democratic figure before he ever takes office. So maybe that would be the argument I would present. I mean, but I agree with you. Like, I don't think you are incorrect in your assessment that electorally defeating Donald Trump would be the best case scenario. But it's a gamble I'm still struggling with, you know?
Yeah, I think the so we talked about this in an earlier podcast, but Fox News is being sued, or was successfully sued, for about $800 million, and there's another lawsuit that's potentially $2 billion. And I think, and mainly those lawsuits were because of lies about voter fraud that Fox News propagated, and the fallout, the amount of money that it cost them was so great that they fired Tucker Carlson, who is their top anchor. So I'm hoping that that will create a precedent where you can't simply be Fox News in the future. You can't simply lie on the national stage because you will be bankrupted. You know what I mean? Like I'm hoping Trump is the last candidate to benefit from a media empire that can simply push misinformation in
Y-
that way.
Yeah, yeah. So that in and of itself is also another video that we could talk about. But I think we're gonna wrap it up because we're at like the 45-minute mark. Exactly the 45-minute mark.
Okay.
Wow. Fowler, do you have any closing thoughts you want to say? Other than God hope the
Um.
audio is not dog shit on this one.
Yeah. If I feel like we brushed up against a lot of topics at the end there, but we didn't go through them. If people have a topic in particular they're interested in us going into more detail about, we can do that for the next video. If
Yep.
someone,
Because I would love to hear
yeah,
y'all's counter. I would love to hear. I'm always a fan of counter argument. So if you guys have any counter, if you have points that you wish Fowler and I had brought out, or you have points of your own that you wish, about what we talked about that you would like to say. I mean, I accept critique, pokes, prods from all ends of the political spectrum. I welcome anybody that supports Donald Trump onto this channel. Flood it. Come tell me that I'm wrong. Humiliate me. Uh, humiliate me so I have something to talk about next podcast. But all right, I don't really have any closing thoughts besides uh I hope the audio is not dog shit on this one because this episode was better than the last one that we recorded. But um
yeah.
make sure you guys like, comment, and subscribe. Thank y'all so much for watching, and I will see y'all in the next video. In the next podcast. We will see y'all in the next podcast.